My brother leaned across the table at the rehearsal dinner and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that he was glad I finally found something I was good at, taking notes. He meant it as a joke. The kind of joke that lands because everyone already believes the punchline. My mother smiled into her wine glass. My father nodded like a man who had nothing to add because nothing needed adding. The 12 people at that table, cousins, future in-laws, my brother's college friends who had known me exactly 4 days, laughed in the way people laugh when they're not sure something is funny, but they want to seem like they understood it. I was 26 years old, sitting at a rehearsal dinner for my brother's wedding in a private dining room at the Langham Hotel in Chicago, and I had a folder in my laptop bag that I had not told anyone about. The folder contained a signed term sheet for a $4.2 million series round that my company had closed 11 days earlier. I said nothing. I picked up my water glass and took a sip and smiled at no one in particular, the way I had been smiling at nothing in particular. The way I had been smiling at nothing in particular, my entire life. That night is where this story ends. But to understand why that moment mattered, to understand why I was sitting there holding a secret that big, while my brother made jokes about my competence, you have to go back a long way. You have to go back to a house in Naperville, Illinois, where I grew up being the wrong kind of child. My brother's name is Marcus. He's 4 years older than me, and from the moment I was old enough to understand the social architecture of our family, I understood that he lived at the center of it, and I lived at the edge. Not outside, just at the edge, where you can see everything but no one is particularly looking back at you. My father runs a small commercial real estate firm. He built it himself over 20 years, and he is proud of it in the way that men who build things with their own hands are proud. Completely, without qualification, and in a way that doesn't leave much room for other things. He is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because I spent a long time being angry at him and an even longer time figuring out that anger was the wrong lens. He is a man who understood one model of success and raised his children inside it. Marcus fit the model. I didn't. That's the whole story, really, except that it took 30 years to play out. Marcus was going to take over the firm. This was never said out loud. My family didn't operate in explicit declarations, but it was communicated in every possible other way. My father took Marcus to client meetings on Saturdays, starting when Marcus was 13. He sat Marcus next to him at dinner parties and let him practice talking to adults. He bought Marcus his first suit when Marcus was 15, for a reason I never quite understood, because Marcus was 15 and had nowhere to wear a suit. But my father understood it as preparation. Everything with Marcus was preparation. With me, things were different, not cruel. I need to keep saying that because cruelty would have been easier to name and easier to leave. With me, things were simply absent. I was there. I was fed and clothed and driven to school and attended recitals and had birthday parties, but I was not being prepared for anything. I was just being raised the way you raise something without a specific destination in mind. I remember one particular Sunday. I was 11, Marcus was 15, when my father spent the entire day teaching Marcus how to read a P&L statement. They sat at the dining room table with printed spreadsheets and a legal pad and my father explaining. Marcus nodding, the two of them in this serious, focused world that didn't require a door to keep me out because I had never been invited in. I sat in the next room doing homework I didn't need help with. And when my mother called us for dinner, my father put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and said, "You're going to be good at this." He said it like a fact. Like he was reporting something that had already happened. He did not say it to me, not that day, not that year. Not, if I'm being honest with myself, in any of the years that followed in a way that I actually believed. My mother is a more complicated portrait. She taught third grade for 20 years before retiring early to help my father with the business, and she is the kind of woman who is enormously capable and entirely invisible about it. She kept everything running. She knew what everyone needed before they knew it themselves. But she had a particular blind spot that took me a long time to understand, which was that she confused capability with contentment. I was good at taking care of myself from a very young age. I managed my own schedule, handled my own problems, never asked for much, and she interpreted that as me being fine. Not that I had learned to be fine because asking for help had never worked particularly well, just that I was fine. It was easier that way, for everyone. She was not cold. She came to everything, every school event, every performance, every game. She said the right things. But there is a difference between being present and being attentive, and I understood the difference early because I felt it in the space between the two. My father's disappointment in me was never spoken. It was carried in small moments. The time I won a regional science competition in ninth grade, and he said, "Good job," and then spent 15 minutes asking Marcus about his history project that Marcus was not particularly proud of and had told my father about, mostly to fill the silence. The time I got accepted to the University of Illinois and my mother cried and my father said, "Good school," and then asked Marcus, who had gotten a C in his accounting class that semester, whether the professor had graded on a curve. The time I tried to tell him, when I was 22 and freshly graduated, that I had an idea for a company and he said, "Claire, you're smart enough, but starting a business is different from being smart. You should get experience first. Work for someone. Learn how it's done." He wasn't wrong, technically. I did need experience. I did learn. I just didn't need his permission to start, and I didn't tell him that. I simply went and did it. The idea came out of something I had noticed during my senior internship at a logistics company in Chicago's West Loop. I was in the operations department, buried in scheduling and routing data, and what I kept seeing, over and over, was that small independent truckers were losing contracts not because their service was bad, but because their bidding process was terrible. They were underbidding on jobs that cost them money and overbidding on jobs they could have won. They had no real-time visibility into fuel costs, route efficiency, or competitive pricing. The big carriers had software for this. The independent operators, the ones running 2 or 3 trucks out of a garage in Cicero or Rockford, had spreadsheets if they were organized and gut instinct if they weren't. I built the first version of the platform in my apartment on Diversey, with $8,000 of my own money and 3 months of evenings and weekends. It was rough and it worked imperfectly, and it had exactly 4 users when I quit my job to focus on it full time, which was a decision I made alone on a Tuesday night and announced to no one in particular, because no one in my family would have understood it and I'd stopped needing them to. My father found out I had quit my job 3 months after the fact, during a Sunday phone call that had started as a routine check-in. When I told him, there was a silence that lasted long enough to become a statement. Then he said he hoped I knew what I was doing. His tone suggested he did not believe that I did. My mother said she was worried about my health insurance. Marcus didn't say anything because I didn't tell Marcus. Marcus and I had never had the kind of relationship where I volunteered information about my life. He was not interested, and I had internalized that disinterest so thoroughly that it no longer registered as a wound. It was just the weather. It was just how things were. The first 2 years were genuinely hard. Not romantically hard. Not the kind of hard that looks good in a TED Talk later when you've already succeeded. Just hard. I had a product that worked for a narrow set of users, and I needed to figure out how to make it work for more of them while simultaneously keeping the users I had, while also trying to convince investors that there was a real business here, and also paying my rent and also, occasionally, sleeping. I lived on a combination of savings, a small business credit card, and a contract I landed in the second month with a regional freight brokerage in Indianapolis that agreed to pilot the platform with 12 of their carrier partners in exchange for feedback and a revenue share that was, in retrospect, far too generous on their end, but that kept me alive long enough to improve the product. My co-founder, a software engineer named James I, had met through a mutual friend from college, joined full-time in month 4. He was the only person outside of my users who knew the full picture of what I was building. He did not tell me it was a good idea. He told me which parts of it were good and which parts needed work, and that honesty was worth more to me than encouragement would have been. I did not tell my family about James. I did not tell my family about the Indianapolis contract. I did not tell my family about the 18 months of iteration that followed. The 3 complete redesigns of the core interface, the loss of 2 early users who went with a competitor, the gain of 8 more who came through word of mouth from the Indianapolis brokerage. I did not tell them any of it because they had given me no reason to believe they were interested, and protecting my work from their indifference had become a habit that I no longer questioned. What my family knew about my life during those years was approximately this. I was doing something with software. I lived in an apartment in Logan Square, and I seemed to be managing okay. My mother worried about my health insurance on a semi-annual basis. My father occasionally suggested I look into corporate positions at companies he knew. Marcus, at Thanksgiving dinners, sometimes asked what the software did in the voice of someone making polite conversation with a stranger at a party. I gave vague answers. They accepted them. The conversation always moved back to Marcus. Marcus's professional life had followed the trajectory my father designed. He joined the firm at 23. worked his way through every department under my father's close supervision, and by 30 was managing the firm's largest client relationships. He was good at it. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy and inaccurate to make Marcus a villain in the story, and he isn't one. Not exactly. He absorbed the confidence that came from being believed in unconditionally, and confidence, channeled correctly, can look a lot like competence. He was charming with clients in the way that people who have always been expected to succeed in rooms like that are charming. He knew how to make older men feel respected and younger ones feel included. What Marcus was not good at was admitting he needed help. This became relevant in the way that personal failings usually become relevant, eventually, at the worst possible time. The firm had grown over the years and had made a significant bet on a development project in the Chicago suburbs, a mixed-use development, residential over retail, the kind of thing that was being greenlit everywhere in 2019, and then ran directly into 2020, and then into supply chain delays, and then into rising interest rates, and then into a retail leasing market that had changed shape while everyone was looking at something else. The project was not going to fail catastrophically, but it was not going to perform the way my father had promised his partners it would perform. Marcus had been the one managing the project. Marcus was the one who had told my father repeatedly that it was fine. By the time my brother's wedding came around, it was not fine. I didn't know the full picture then. I knew fragments. An overheard phone call during Christmas, my father's face at dinner one evening in a way I had never quite seen before. A clipped exchange between Marcus and my father near the garage after a family gathering. I knew something was off, but I was used to being on the periphery of information, and I had not been invited into the conversation, so I stayed where I was. My company, by contrast, was doing something I had not let myself believe was possible until recently. We had closed the Series A 11 days before my brother's rehearsal dinner. The round was led by a Chicago-based venture fund I had been building a relationship with for 14 months. It was $4.2 million, which meant I could hire the sales team I needed and build the enterprise features that would let us move upmarket. We had 43 carrier clients and were running a pilot with a national logistics provider that would not have taken my calls 18 months earlier. I had not told my family. I had not told them about the seed round the year before. I had not told them about any of it, and my reasons had evolved over time from protecting my work from their indifference to something that was both simpler and harder to explain. I wanted to see who they were without the information. I had spent my entire life being evaluated by people who had decided in advance what they thought of me. And I wanted to know, needed to know, whether they were capable of just seeing me. Seeing me without the credentials, without the proof. They were not. The rehearsal dinner was at the Langham, which is a hotel in downtown Chicago that my family had chosen because my future sister-in-law's family was from Connecticut and accustomed to a certain level of occasion, and my father had wanted to make an impression. It was a beautiful room. I remember the way the light came off the river through the windows, and the flowers on the table that my mother had agonized over for weeks, and my brother's face when his fiancée walked in, which was a face I had never quite seen him make before, open and unguarded and genuinely happy in a way that made me think better of him in that moment than I had in years. Then the dinner started, and Marcus being Marcus, and the room being what it was, full of people who had flown in from the East Coast to celebrate him, people who had been hearing about him for years the way I had been standing in the room next to him for years, he became himself, expansive, generous with his attention for everyone except me. He told stories and made toasts and filled every corner of the room with his voice. I was seated between my cousin from my mother's side, who I like and had not seen in 2 years, and one of Marcus's college roommates who had a job in finance and who spent most of the dinner asking me questions about the tech industry in a way that was just polite enough that I couldn't tell whether he was genuinely curious or filling time. I was telling him something about freight logistics. Because when people ask me about the tech industry, I end up talking about freight logistics whether I intend to or not. When Marcus's voice cut across the table, he'd been telling a story about a camping trip they'd taken in college, and it had somehow turned into a story about me. I'm still not entirely sure how, and the punchline was that I had always been good at one thing, which was taking notes. That was it. That was the joke. Claire's good at taking notes. The room laughed. My father smiled. My mother looked at her glass. Marcus looked at me with the expression he always wore when he was being funny, expectant, a little pleased with himself, waiting for confirmation that the joke had landed. I gave him nothing. I looked back at him for one long moment and then returned to my conversation with the college roommate, who seemed to sense something and pivoted to asking about my cousin's work in sustainable agriculture. I sat with the joke for the rest of the evening. It was not the worst thing Marcus had ever said to me. It wasn't even close. But something about the room, the lingam, the river light, the fact that I had a term sheet in my bag for $4.2 million that no one at this table knew existed made it land differently than it would have otherwise. I thought about telling him. I actually thought about it. Opening the laptop bag, pulling out the folder, sliding it across the tablecloth. I thought about it for a moment and then let the moment pass. Not yet. The wedding was on a Saturday in September. The ceremony was at 4th Presbyterian on Michigan Avenue, another choice driven by the East Coast family, and the reception was at a venue in the West Loop that had been an industrial space and was now the kind of place that charged $12,000 for a Saturday and had a waiting list. My future sister-in-law had good taste. The whole day had the feeling of something that had been planned very carefully and was executing close to perfectly. I was a bridesmaid, which my sister-in-law had asked me to be, in an email that was warm and genuine and which I had said yes to because I liked her. Whatever my complicated feelings about my brother, I wore the dress she had chosen, which was a deep green that worked better for me than it did for some of the other bridesmaids, and I stood in the right places and smiled in the right photographs and handed her the bouquet at the correct moment. I know how to perform the rituals of family. I've been doing it my entire life. The reception was where things became interesting. My father gave a toast that was, I'll admit, moving. He talked about watching Marcus grow up, about the pride he felt, about the kind of man Marcus had become. He said he couldn't wait to see what the next chapter looked like. He was not wrong. Marcus was someone to be proud of, in ways that I could see even through the particular fog of being his sister. The toast landed the way it was supposed to. Then my mother gave a shorter toast, sweet and funny and exactly what it needed to be, and she cried at the end in the good way. Then Marcus's college roommate, the one from the rehearsal dinner, the one who worked in finance, stood up. He was the best man. His name was Greg. I had not paid much attention to Greg at the rehearsal dinner because I had been managing my own interior weather, but I was paying attention now because Greg, it turned out, was the managing director at a Chicago office of a venture firm that had co-led the Series A round my company had just closed. I had not made the connection. I don't know how I hadn't made it. Greg Callahan. The name had been in documents I had reviewed for months, but Greg Callahan goes by Gregory Callahan in professional contexts, and Marcus had introduced him at the rehearsal dinner as just Greg in my brain, apparently, had not connected the two. He gave a funny and generous toast about Marcus. Then he sat down. And then, in a conversational interlude, while the dinner plates were being cleared, he turned to the table and said he had heard there was a Claire here, and he looked directly at me, who ran a freight tech company that one of his colleagues had mentioned recently with what he described as unusual enthusiasm. I said yes, that was me. He said his colleague had spoken very highly of the platform. He said he had looked it up after the rehearsal dinner when my freight logistics comment had lodged in his mind. He said it had lodged in his mind, and that he would like to find a time to talk if I was open to it. I told him I would send him a calendar link in the morning. My father, who was at the adjacent table, had heard this exchange. I saw him turn his head. I saw him register the name of Greg's firm. It's not an obscure name in Chicago business circles. And I saw something move across his face that I had never quite seen there before. It was not pride. I don't want to dress it up as something it wasn't. It was recalculation. It was the specific expression of a man who has just received information that doesn't fit his model of the world and is now, quietly, updating the model. I didn't acknowledge it. I turned back to Greg and asked him what specifically his colleague had said, and we talked for 20 minutes about freight logistics and market dynamics and the opportunity in the independent carrier segment, while around us, people danced to a cover band playing songs from the 90s, and my brother and his new wife moved through the room receiving the warmth of everyone, who loved them. My mother found me near the bar during a slow song, in the way that mothers find you when they have something to say that they're not sure how to say. She put her hand on my arm and stood beside me looking at the dance floor for a moment before she spoke. She said she hadn't realized. I asked what she hadn't realized, she said, and she was struggling with the words in a way that was genuine, I could tell, which made it harder rather than easier. She said she hadn't realized how seriously I was taking the business, that she thought of it as something I was trying, and she hadn't understood it was something I was building. I turned to look at her. She was watching the dance floor. My brother was dancing with his wife, and they looked genuinely happy, and I felt no bitterness about that. I want to be clear about that. But I looked at my mother and I understood, in a way that was complete and final, that she had spent years filing me under a category that didn't require close attention. Trying. She had thought of me as trying. I said, I've been building this for 3 years. She said she knew that. I said, you didn't ask about it once in 3 years. Not once. Not what the product did, not who the customers were, not whether it was working. She looked at me then, and her face was complicated, not defensive, which surprised me. Something more like grief. She said, we should have asked. I said, yes. She said, your father wants to talk to you. She paused. He has some questions. I almost hit something sharp. I felt it right there. The thing I had been holding for 20 years right at the surface. Instead, I said, he knows where I am. Then I ordered a gin and tonic and went back to the dance floor and danced with my cousin from my mother's side, who had no idea any of this had happened and who was an excellent dancer. And for a few songs, I was just a person at a wedding, which was all I had wanted to be. My father called the following Wednesday. The conversation had the careful, deliberate quality of something he had been preparing, which made it both more and less than I needed it to be. He asked about the company, how it started, what it did, how the funding worked. His questions were informed in a way that told me he had done some research, which was both touching and a little painful, because it was the first research he had ever done about something I was building. I answered him directly. I did not make it easy and I did not make it hard. I told him the truth about how the company started, including the part about the internship observation and the apartment on Diversey and the $8,000 that was every dollar I had at the time. I told him about James and about the Indianapolis contract and about the 18 months of iteration that almost broke us and then didn't. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I didn't give you enough credit. 6 words. I had waited 30 years for 6 words, and when they came, they were genuine, and also, somehow, not enough, and also exactly the right amount for what this particular conversation could hold. I said I appreciated that. I meant it. He said he'd been talking to Marcus about the development project. He said things were more complicated than he had understood. I said I had sensed that, he said, and I could hear how much this cost him, that Marcus had been managing the communications and that some of the information my father had been receiving had been optimistic in a way that wasn't fully accurate. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said he would like my perspective on something, if I was willing. He said he had seen how I operated, from what Greg had told him. Apparently Greg and my father had talked at the wedding, which I had not known, and he thought my way of looking at things might be useful. I said I would be glad to talk. I said I was not going to pretend the last 30 years hadn't happened, and I was not going to step into a role I hadn't been given on my own terms. But I said I was willing to have a conversation. He said that was fair. Then he said he was proud of me, and I said thank you, and that was where we left it. Not resolved, not repaired, but open in a way it had never been open before, which was its own kind of progress. Marcus and I had dinner 2 weeks later, just the two of us, at a Thai place in Wicker Park. That was neither of our choices particularly, just neutral ground. He was jet-lagged from the honeymoon and looked both happier and more tired than I had seen him in years. We ordered and talked about the honeymoon for a while, and then the conversation slowed and we sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have something real to say and are deciding whether to say it. Marcus said, Greg told me you're kind of a big deal. I said, Greg is generous. Marcus said, is that actually what you think, or are you just being modest? I said I thought we had built something real and I thought there was a lot left to build. He was quiet. He was looking at the table. Then he said, I never asked you about it, any of it. I said, no. He said, at the rehearsal dinner, the notes thing. He stopped. That was a stupid thing to say. I said, yeah. He said, he was working through something. I think I've been afraid that if you were doing something good, that meant I was supposed to acknowledge it, and I didn't know how to do that without it meaning something about everything else. I asked him what everything else meant. He said he had spent his whole life being told he was the one who was going to do something significant. And then he looked at the project and looked at where things stood, and he looked at his sister, who had been invisible to him for 30 years and was apparently running a venture-backed company, and he said it had made him feel like he had been building something that didn't entirely belong to him. I didn't have an easy response to that. It was the most honest thing Marcus had ever said to me, and I sat with it for a moment before I answered. I said, "The difference is that what I built is actually mine. Not because I earned it and you didn't. Just because no one gave me the other option." He nodded. I don't know if he fully understood, but he nodded. We ate our dinner and talked for another hour about his project, about my company, about the kind of things two people who have never quite known each other talk about when they're deciding whether to try. It wasn't a transformation. One dinner doesn't transform 30 years. But it was a beginning, and I was willing to hold it as that. I think about the Langham a lot. I think about sitting at that table with a term sheet in my bag and my brother making a joke about what I was good at. And I think about the fact that I said nothing. People ask me sometimes why I didn't say anything. Why I didn't correct him, or defend myself, or produce the folder. The honest answer is that it wouldn't have mattered. Not because the information wasn't real, but because the problem was never that they didn't have enough information about me. They had plenty of information. They had 30 years of information. The problem was that they had decided a very long time ago what category I belonged in, and information alone doesn't move people out of categories they've chosen. What moves people is reality asserting itself in a room where they can't manage the narrative. A managing director at a venture firm saying, "I've heard unusual things about your freight tech company" in front of my father at my brother's wedding. That's what moved them, not my folder, not my numbers. The moment when the world they were in stopped reflecting back what they had decided to see. I didn't plan it. I genuinely didn't. Greg and Marcus being friends was a coincidence that I could not have orchestrated if I tried. The exchange at the reception was not a reveal I had staged. I simply had kept building, kept working, kept becoming someone real in a world they couldn't see, and eventually those two worlds occupied the same room. I have a company now with 11 employees and a partnership that has changed the shape of the business. I have a relationship with my father that is careful and real and nothing like what it might have been if things had gone differently. I have a brother I am genuinely getting to know for the first time in my adult life, which is strange and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally in moments I don't expect. Actually good. I do not have the version of my family that I needed when I was 11, standing in the hallway outside my father's office, waiting to be included in a photograph I was never in. That version doesn't exist and never will. What I have is what I built, the company, the relationships, the self that knows what it's worth without requiring anyone else to confirm it. That self was built in the years when no one was watching. In the apartment, on Diversey. In the conversations with James at 2 a.m. about whether the product was actually solving the right problem. In the 18 months that almost broke us and didn't. They call me the family afterthought. They called me that in so many words, in so many wordless ways. For most of my life. What they didn't understand, because they weren't paying attention, was that the afterthought had already become the author, and the only story I was ever trying to write was my own. I've thought a lot about what actually happened at that wedding reception. Not the surface of it, not Greg turning to me across the table, not my father's face doing that quiet recalculation, but the mechanics underneath. Why that moment? Why then? Why not earlier, when I had already built something real, or later, when the company was even further along? The answer I keep coming back to is simple and a little uncomfortable. It happened then because I had done the work for long enough that reality had no choice but to show up. That's not magic. That's not luck. That's just what happens when you keep building something true in a world that isn't watching. Eventually, the world has to adjust. I used to think the problem was that my family didn't have enough information about me. I spent years half believing that if they just knew what I was doing, they would see me differently. But that was wrong. They had information. They had 30 years of information. Every report card, every small success, every moment I handled something difficult without asking for help. The problem was never a lack of data. The problem was that they had made a decision about what category I belonged in, and they were filtering everything through that decision without realizing they were doing it. Marcus put me in the afterthought category when we were children, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular blindness that comes from never being asked to look. My father put me there because his model of success had a specific shape and I didn't fit it. My mother put me there because I was capable, and she confused capable with content, and nobody corrected her because the correction would have required a kind of honesty our family was not practiced in. What I understand now is that none of that was about me. It was about them, their limitations, their models, their fear of revising the stories they had already written. I was not the problem. I was just the person standing in the room where the problem lived. The part that took me longest to learn, and I mean genuinely learn, not just say, is that building something real requires accepting, for a period that might be years, that the people who should be watching aren't. That your discipline has to come from inside because the outside isn't going to give it to you. That the work has to be its own reward, at least for a while, because there is no applause in an apartment in Logan Square at 2 in the morning when you're rewriting the same interface for the third time because the second version still isn't right. James understood this. My co-founder never told me the idea was good. He told me which parts worked and which parts didn't, and that honesty was worth more than any encouragement would have been. That's the kind of relationship that actually builds something. Not the kind that makes you feel seen, but the kind that holds you accountable to what you said you were going to do. I think about Marcus now differently than I used to. He had every advantage, and he built inside those advantages, and then the advantages shifted, and he didn't know how to stand without them. I had nothing handed to me, and I built outside the advantages I wasn't given, and when the ground shifted, I was already used to standing on something I had made myself. That's not a moral victory. That's just cause and effect. What you build when no one's watching is exactly what holds you up when everyone finally looks. My father said he hadn't given me enough credit. 6 words. I'd waited a long time for something like that. And when it came, it was enough. Not because it erased anything, but because it was true. And truth has a weight that performance never does. He meant it. That mattered. It just didn't change what I already knew about my own worth, which is the whole point. By the time they saw me, I had already seen myself clearly for years. The recognition was information. It wasn't foundation. The foundation was already built.